Okay, why are we still having this conversation? Every few years, a debate around whether or not video games make people violent bubbles back up. And honestly, it usually feels like a tired moral panic. But then something truly horrifying has to come along. Not your usual hyper-violent shooter or edgy horror game, but something so vile it makes me want to throw my computer out of the window. There exists a rape fantasy game called No Mercy, which has recently caught the eye of the internet. Yeah, you heard that right. A game in which you progress by dominating the women in your life, in particular, your mother or your stepmother, depending on what you choose. It's hard for me to even say that without feeling gross, and to be honest, it should be. These aren't just edgy plots or questionable mechanics, they're games that make sexual violence an option as part of interaction. And the internet exploded. Social media lit up with justifiable outrage. Some were asking how this stuff was even allowed to exist, and others were somehow defending it under the tired old freedom of expression banner. And some even had the audacity to say that statistically a lot of women have rape fantasies, so what's the problem? Typical, isn't it, that these men can mansplain women's sexual desires. But let's be very clear, there's a massive difference between a private, internal fantasy, something shaped by power dynamics, trauma, or subconscious storytelling, and a commercial product designed to let players act out sexual violence for entertainment. One is about exploring taboo in a safe, consensual space. The other is about selling it, gamifying it, and then defending it when people say, hey, this is actually a bit disturbing, and invoking women's private fantasies as justification for a playable rape simulator isn't just intellectually dishonest. It's misogynistic and manipulative. After some pressure, the game was removed from Steam, and a half-assed apology or explanation, whatever you want to call it, came out that basically said some people have private fantasies, such as incest. And then, equated incest to liking feet. Yeah, because, wanting to have sex with your sister or your mother is exactly the same as liking feet. For a more detailed rundown about the specifics and the timeline, I would highly recommend you watch Jessica's video on the topic. Because this video, it's not necessarily going to be about that. It's also not about blaming all of gaming on the worst things it can produce. But we are going to dig into how media, especially interactive media like games, can shape the way that we think, feel, and act. Because even if there's no straight line from playing a violent video game to committing a violent act, the things that we consume and engage with do something. They can affect how we relate to others, what we normalize, what we joke about, and what we excuse. We're going to look at what psychology and media theory actually says about games and behaviour, and how cultural critiques, plus, a little bit of Oscar Wilde, as I've got to put that drama degree to use somehow, can help us unpack what happens when art starts to look a little too much like a social experiment gone wrong. Wilde once said that life imitates art far more than art imitates life. And with a game like No Mercy, that's not just a clever quote. It's a warning. But let's rewind for a second. The panic over whether or not video games make people violent, that's been around forever. At least as long as video games have been around. Back in the 90s, it was all about blaming Mortal Kombat and Doom for every teenage outburst. It's the games, I'm telling you, it's the games that they play these days. Then came Grand Theft Auto, and suddenly it was all about, what if kids find crime fun? The cycle of media-induced moral freakout isn't new, it's just louder now, thanks to the internet. And in academic circles, this debate has been running on parallel tracks. One of the most cited contributions to this conversation is laid out by Anderson and Bushman in 2001. According to them, exposure to violent video games increases aggressive thoughts, feelings, and behaviours by reinforcing aggressive scripts in the brain. Basically, play enough violent games and you start to think that violence is normal. Or worse, useful. That just kind of makes sense. It is a logical conclusion to come to, right? But not everyone thought that. Psychologist Christopher Ferguson has been one of the loudest critics of this model. And honestly, for good reason. He's pointed out some major methodological flaws in aggression research, like tiny sample sizes, poor definitions of what aggression even is. Like, is yelling during Mario Kart now a clinical event? Is playing Overcooked with my partner and friends going to ruin real life relationships? Or am I now a danger to animals because I enjoy catching Pokemon and making them battle to 1 health point? Ferguson's work suggests that so-called links between games and violence are overhyped. They're also statistically weak and are often rooted in researcher bias. Even large-scale meta-analysis, those big studies that combine a ton of data, have found that if there is a connection between violent games and real-world aggression, it's either very small or straight up non-existent. And crucially, they found no evidence that playing violent games leads to criminal violence, so no, playing Call of Duty doesn't turn you into a school shooter. But here's where things get complicated. Games like No Mercy don't just depict violence, they sexualize it, and that shifts the debate from about one general aggression to something deeper and much more disturbing. Sexual deviance. Suddenly we're not talking about is shooting fake people bad, but what does it mean when someone gets pleasure or entertainment from simulating sexual assault? That's not just a behavioural question, it's a cultural one. It cuts how we view consent, power and fantasy, and the stories we're telling through play. And let's be real, this isn't just a more extreme version of violence. It's something else entirely. Because once you layer gender, sexuality, and the specific history of how women's bodies have been commodified in media, we're dealing with a whole different beast. So if the old moral panic was asking, do violent games make you punch someone? The new one might be, what kind of culture lets you rehearse rape as entertainment and then calls it freedom of expression? But let's talk about this term, moral panic. Now, you've probably seen this described as that, a moral panic, which is a term that people love to throw around whenever there's public outrage, regardless of whether people agree with that outrage or not. It's just another moral panic, they say, as if concern around a rape fantasy game is some kind of overreaction. But that phrase does actually mean something. It was coined by sociologist Stanley Cohen in the 1970s. According to Cohen, moral panics happen when the media and society latch onto a new folk devil, usually a person, group, or product that threatens the status quo. The media then amplifies that threat, politicians pile on, and suddenly you've got headlines screaming about the destruction of society over a punk haircut or immigration. Sound familiar? So in that sense, yeah, the backlash to games like this could be read as a moral panic. But here's the thing, Cohen's theory doesn't say that moral panics are always unjustified, just that the reaction is disproportionate to the culturally charged. Are people truly overreacting to this game, or are they reacting as they should to something fundamentally broken? If we look at Gerbner's cultivation theory, the concern starts to make sense. The more time you spend immersed in certain types of media, the more your worldview starts to reflect that media. Wow. Mind blown. Watch enough crime series and you'll start to overestimate how many people get murdered. Play enough violent games and maybe the world starts to look a little bit more like a war zone. So, if you're peeking around aisle corners and a noise from above sounds like a hatch opening, maybe that's a sign that you need to chill out on the siege a little bit. It's not about immediate brainwashing, it's about gradual normalization. Now take that idea and apply it to No Mercy. If players are spending hours interacting with mechanics that reward sexual domination, then what's being cultivated there? What kind of messages are being reinforced? Not just about sex, but about gender, consent, and violence. This leads us to symbolic annihilation, a term coined by scholar Gay Tuchman, which refers to how media can both erase or distort the experiences of marginalised groups simply by not representing them, or worse, misrepresenting them. In games where women only appear as objects to be assaulted or dominated, as the game puts on its domination meter, their real-world suffering is rendered invisible. They're not characters, they're mechanics, and that distortion does damage. And of course, we can't ignore the feminist perspective here. Karen Boyle has written extensively about how media representations of sexual violence often sensationalizes the act without centering the victim's experience. They either aestheticize the violence or reduce it to a plot device, which only furthers the cultural desensitization to real-life trauma. In that context, a game like this doesn't just reflect existing misogyny. It trains players to view sexual violence as not only normal, but as entertaining and a way to achieve something. So yeah, media coverage on No Mercy might look like a classic moral panic on the surface, but when you zoom in, it's not just about public outrage or clickbait headlines, it's about real ethical questions. Are we witnessing overreaction? Or is this just one of those moments where the culture is actually reacting fast enough to say, hang on a minute, this is too far? Now let's get decadent, Oscar Wilde style. In his 1891 essay, The Decay of Lying, Wilde drops one of his most controversial takes. Life imitates art far more than art imitates life. At first, he sounds like he's just being cheeky, as usual. What else would you expect from Oscar Wilde? But he's actually making a serious philosophical point here. Wilde believed that art doesn't just mirror reality, it creates the lens through which we see it. Art shapes taste, perception, and even what we think is possible. Reality isn't the source, art is. So maybe, we should fund it a little bit more. So when we look at something like No Mercy, Wilde's idea hits differently. It's not just art imitating life, it's a simulation shaping how life itself could be understood. If Wilde was right, then cultural products, especially immersive, interactive ones like games, aren't just reflecting dark fantasies. They're teaching them, rehearsing them, rewriting ethical lines. And this isn't just Wilde being dramatic. Media theorist Jean Baudrillard took this further with his theory, simulacra and simulation. According to him, we're living in a hyperreality, a world where representations become more real than the reality that they supposedly reflect. In other words, the map becomes the territory, the image becomes the truth, and the simulation doesn't just copy reality, it replaces it. So here's the uncomfortable question. Is No Mercy a hyperreal scenario? A simulation that's so immersive, so playable that it blurs the boundary between representation and endorsement. From the few clips I've seen, it seems like the game is quite hard to play. It's not very smooth running, which just makes me think that if you continue to play it, you're playing it for that domination. So if Baudrillard is right, then we're not just seeing disturbing content, we're engaging with it in ways that train us to either accept it or trivialize it. And Wilde might argue that that's exactly what art does. It reshapes the real. But it doesn't just reshape it in a vacuum. There is this thing called rape culture, a term used to describe the normalization, trivialization, and sometimes even justification of sexual violence in society. It's the jokes, the victim blaming, the disbelief, and the statistics. And those numbers, those statistics, they're grim. But here's the catch. No one believes them. According to the US Department of Justice, only about 25 out of every 1,000 rapists will ever go to prison. The conviction rate is 2.5%. But the truly depressing part is that the wider public, both in the US and in the UK, often chooses to disbelieve these numbers. In the UK, recent surveys show that nearly 1 in 4 people still believe false rape allegations are a widespread problem, and while false accusations are rare, around 2% to 8% of reported cases, the misunderstanding of consent combined with a social tendency to question the victim continues to perpetuate a cycle where survivors remain silent, blamed, or ignored. For more on the effects of victim blaming and this idea of the perfect victim, please check out a previous video that I did on this topic. And if we consider a recent real-world case, then this underlines how deeply this cultural disbelief runs. A gynecology student in Europe was accused of rape after assaulting a woman. The case shocked many, but not because of the brutality of its crime, but because of the leniency shown to the perpetrator. Despite clear evidence and public outcry, the court chose not to imprison him. Why? Because it would ruin his career. As a future doctor, a doctor that, would be looking at women's private areas all day, I see absolutely nothing wrong with that. This case speaks volumes about the ingrained, gendered and classed attitudes in legal and medical institutions. The priority was his career over the victim's dignity and safety. This horrific decision reveals a culture that often places greater value on the perpetrator's future than on the recovery and justice of the survivor. And that's just one example where career aspirations and perceived potential override fundamental justice for victims. Consent, the most basic principle, is regularly misinterpreted in both media and reality. When a game like this simulates non-consensual acts for entertainment and for the sake of progress in the game, it doesn't just reflect this confusion, it reinforces it, that it's okay in certain situations. It places consent at the center of a power game, making it seem negotiable, fluid, and sometimes irrelevant. Players are encouraged to dominate without even questioning the ethics of that domination. And where society already has a hard time understanding what constitutes as rape, where over 50% of sexual assaults are never reported, and of those that are, many are dismissed or dropped, games like these do far more than trivialize the issue. They help to normalize it. Now, if we return to Oscar Wilde's idea that life imitates art far more than art imitates life, we can see a crucial point. As culture continues to consume, try saying that 5 times fast, increasingly extreme depictions of violence and sexual assault, then it's not just reflecting real-world behavior. It's literally shaping it. The hyperreality created by these representations start to influence not just how we see violence, but how we react to it in everyday life. Wilde's perspective offers a stark warning. The more we immerse ourselves in art that blurs the lines of morality, the more those blurred lines seep into our real-world judgments and behaviours. Art, in this case, becomes the framework for how we respond to issues like rape and consent. So Wilde's statement should not just be taken as a simple justification for pushing artistic boundaries, but rather it's a warning. When the boundary between art and reality becomes too indistinct, we risk losing our moral compass altogether. The simulated world of no mercy becomes dangerously intertwined with the lived experiences of survivors, and the real-world consequences of ignoring those lines can be devastating. And after all that, people are defending this game's right to exist. The debate around video games that tackle extreme or controversial content, such as rape fantasy games, touches on a deeply rooted tension between artistic freedom and social responsibility. Video games, like any form of art, have long been positioned as creative expressions, where developers and artists can explore new worlds, push boundaries, and engage with difficult or provocative themes. But when those themes involve sexual violence and other harmful behaviours, a more critical question emerges. To what extent should artistic expression be protected? And at what point does it become socially irresponsible or even harmful? This debate can be approached through 2 different ethical perspectives: consequentialism and deontology. Consequentialism is an ethical framework that judges actions based on their outcomes. From this standpoint, the focus would be on the potential consequences of allowing or creating such a game. Do these types of games normalize normalize harmful behaviors or attitudes? Does their existence in a larger cultural context potentially encourage aggressive or non-consensual actions? Critics like Anita Sarkeesian, founder of Feminist Frequency and creator of the series Tropes vs. Women in Video Games, argued that repeated exposure to problematic content, such as the trivialization of rape or sexual violence, reinforces harmful stereotypes, desensitizes players to violence, and could ultimately contribute to real-world harm. Sarkeesian's critique focuses on the role of representation in media and how repetitive portrayals of women as victims in games directly impact social attitudes towards gender and consent. For her, the implications of a game like No Mercy aren't limited to its fictional world. They reinforce a rape culture that diminishes real-world accountability and survivors' experiences. On the other hand, deontology emphasizes duties and rules over the consequences of actions. This framework would look at the moral rightness or wrongness of creating such a game in the first place, independent of its outcomes and effects. The mere creation and distribution of content that involves non-consensual acts may be seen as inherently unethical, regardless of whether it encourages violent behavior. Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative, for example, argues that humans should be treated as an end in themselves rather than a means to an end. By this measure, a rape fantasy game could be considered unethical simply because it objectifies individuals and fails to respect the inherent dignity of all human beings. When we examine No Mercy specifically, we often see two opposing viewpoints. Proponents of artistic freedoms, including developers and defenders, will often argue that games are a form of fantasy, and as such, the distinction between simulation and endorsement is key. The argument is that creating a game that portrays rape or sexual violence does not equate to promoting or encouraging these behaviours in the real world. As one game developer said, it's just fantasy. It's not real. From this perspective, the game is no different from any other form of fictional media, such as a horror film or a crime drama where extreme actions are dramatised for the sake of narrative engagement. You know, I don't watch Dexter so that I can justify murdering people, or do I? They argue that people that enjoy violent or taboo content are well aware that it is fictional and are not likely to confuse it with real-life morality. It's just a game, they say. Why should we censor art? Because of the perceived social harm. However, this perspective fails to fully account for the profound ways in which repeated exposure to disturbing content may influence behaviour and societal attitudes. While some players may indeed distinguish fantasy from reality, and most people I would like to think would see a game like this and see it for what it is, horrifying. Others might internalise the attitudes and ideas presented in these games, leading to desensitization or worse, the normalisation of violence and coercion as acceptable behaviour. Now you'd think that, normal working adults would have the brain cells to understand that this kind of behaviour isn't okay, though I'm not holding my breath with that one. What happens when children get a hold of this game? And yeah, it's an 18 plus, but how secure is that really? Let's be honest. The line between stimulation and real-world impact then becomes blurred, particularly in the case of more immersive forms of entertainment where players are actively participating and making decisions in the game's world. The industry response to these controversial games offers a reflection of the ongoing tension between artistic freedom and social responsibility. Platforms like Steam and Patreon have become the primary gatekeepers of digital content, each adopting their own policies regarding what content is acceptable. Steam, for instance, has allowed adult games, including those with extreme sexual content, to be sold through its platform, only pulling those titles in response to backlash or controversy. Critics argue that these platforms, while claiming to support artistic freedom, may still be enabling content that promotes harmful ideas. In fact, the community-driven nature of these platforms often amplifies this issue, with some users actively seeking out the most taboo or disturbing content, and the developers, driven by profit, providing just that. There's a gap in the market after all, let's fill it with some disturbing, very unethical content. Why not? Money makes the world go round, boys. The platform's hesitance to regulate content raises significant concerns about the degree of responsibility digital marketplaces should bear for the products that they host. On the flip side, when Patreon removed a creator's account for producing a game with violent non-consensual themes, it sparked an uproar among supporters of free speech, who argued that these actions are overreaching censorship. Supporters of this position often claim that artistic freedom should allow creators to push the boundaries of social discourse, even if that involves exploring uncomfortable or taboo subjects. The platform's policies suggest a double standard. They claim to respect the autonomy of artists while curating content to meet the demands of public outrage or legal restrictions. For example, in the case of No Mercy, it was often community backlash and negative press that forced these platforms to act. It raises the question: who gets to decide what is acceptable content, and at what point does censorship interfere with creative expression? The ethical dilemma here isn't whether or not we can sell such games, but whether we should. The issue becomes more complex when we factor in the collective responsibility of developers, platforms, and consumers. While creators and defenders of artistic freedom argue that games are simply art, it's crucial to consider how media shapes the cultural landscape, especially when it comes to sensitive issues like consent and sexual violence. The question isn't just about fantasy. It's about what kind of world we're creating through the stories we choose to tell, and how these stories shape the realities that we live in. The debate over the potential risk between video games and real-world violence or sexual aggression remains a complex and contentious issue. Whilst academic research has not conclusively proven a direct causal relationship, the concern persists that these cultural products, especially when they depict extreme or harmful content, may still play a role in shaping societal attitudes. Video games, like other forms of media, do not exist in a vacuum. They reflect, amplify, and sometimes challenge the values of the society that produces them. In the case of games like No Mercy, the controversy highlights the need for an ongoing ethical and cultural dialogue. While some may argue that these games are merely a form of entertainment or fantasy, we must consider how they shape our collective understanding of consent, power, and sexual violence. The line between fiction and reality is often blurred in the digital age, and the consequences of that blurring are far-reaching, especially when the content in question perpetuates harmful stereotypes or normalizes dangerous behaviors. As we continue to navigate this interaction of art, ethics, and social responsibility, we must ask ourselves, if life does imitate art, what world are we trying to create through these games? But what do I know? Let me know what you think down in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like and subscribe if you're new. And with that, I'll see you soon.